Good evening. I'd like to call to order the Town of Los Gatos Special Joint Meeting of the Town Council and Finance Commission. There is only one topic tonight, and that is to discuss government budgeting and financial reporting, and to make this a interactive study session. So we will call the roll and then take public comment first. But if, just in terms of the flow of the meeting, so our guest from the GFOA will provide a presentation during the course of the meeting, and there will be the opportunity to ask questions along the way. So if someone has a question, raise their hand, and then I'll recognize you. With that, let's take the roll.
Commissioner Rogers?
Here.
Commissioner Keown? Commissioner Fisher? Vice Chair Monk?
Here.
Chair Reiners?
Here.
Councilmember Isto?
Here.
Councilmember Ennie?
Here.
Councilmember Badami?
Here.
Vice Mayor Moore?
Here.
Mayor Hudes?
Here. So with that, we will take verbal communications. If anyone has questions or comments that they'd like to offer right at the beginning of the meeting on this topic, this is the time to do that. I don't have any cards. Is there anyone online who would like to ask questions?
There are no hands raised on Zoom.
Okay, so we'll close verbal communications and we'll move right to other business. And I have to say, I'm very excited about us having this session. I have, for a long time, thought it would be really important to do this. And so thank you to the town manager for organizing this and putting this together.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, an honorable council and finance commission. This is a long time coming to have a joint meeting of the council and the finance commission. Very important as it pertains to our budget, financial reporting, and our fiscal outlook. Education of council members and commissioners that are in key roles is in a lot of cities lacking. So the opportunity to bring somebody in from the outside who does this on a daily basis, who trains and educates finance professionals nationally, I think it's a real coup for the town to actually have that. And so let me introduce Katie Ludwig, who just flew in this morning from Chicago. She's the Director of Resource Development for the Government Finance Officers Association's Research and Consulting Center. The GFOA is the premier organization that advises and creates best practices for financial reporting, budgeting, and a lot of other areas within the local government, school district, and special district sphere. And so to have somebody of her caliber here is absolutely incredible. She has advised on many, many, many governments. She teaches the Premier Budgeting Academy. That's a week-long training course that happens several times during the course of the year. She has helped local governments develop policies and procedures and implemented systems to improve their efficiency and effectiveness. So not only does the GFOA educate, they also come in and do consultative services with different agencies on a wide variety of topics, from ERP implementations to training such as this. Prior to joining the GFOA, Katie worked for 4.5 years at the Chicago Housing Authority, where she was responsible for the management and operations of the Housing Choice Voucher Program, a very large program. She also worked for the City of Chicago for more than 13 years, serving in a variety of roles in the Office of Management and Budget, the Department of Housing, and the Chicago Public Library. While at the Department of Housing, Katie was responsible for implementing the city's Neighborhood Stabilization Program, a $170 million federal grant program aimed at putting vacant, foreclosed homes back into productive use. She has a BA in English and Political Science from DePaul University, and she received her Master's of Public Policy from the Harris School at the University of Chicago. I've had the pleasure of being in some of her trainings and seminars, and even training side by side her, and I can tell you I am very fortunate to have a town that has the ability to bring her out to do this for us. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Stole some of my thunder there, but a little bit about GFOA. We'll go ahead and get started. So excited to be here. Okay. A little bit about GFOA before I jump into this. Some of you may be familiar, but for those of you who aren't, our mission really is to advance excellence in public finance, and we also tack on this point of to support thriving communities, right? We don't want you to have good finances just to pat yourself on the back and be like, we have awesome finances. You're doing this because you want to support and build a thriving community. We've been around a long time, since 1906. We are a membership organization. We've got over 25,000 members across the United States and Canada. And unlike a lot of membership organizations, Chris mentioned, we also provide some services. So we provide consulting services, and we do a lot of research as well. So we established our research and consulting arm in 1977 and really created this team of folks to focus on technology consulting in particular in 1998. Again, we do a lot of different work. In addition to the consulting and the research I mentioned, we've got awards programs. So we do budget awards, ACFRA awards, a popular annual financial reporting award. We have a magazine that comes out every other month. We offer lots of networking opportunities. We've got all different kinds of affinity groups for our members to get to their small government forum, large government forums, just different ways for utility finance forum, right? Different ways for our members to interact with one another, get to learn from each other. We put on a conference every year. I play a big role in that. We've got over 80 concurrent sessions that in some way, shape, or form, I have a hand in all of those sessions. So yeah, that's just a little bit about us. And then Chris told you about me. Sorry. But I've been with GFOA since 2018. I'm very passionate. I love local government. I've only ever worked in local government or with local government. So this is like what just gets me going. I really, really like it. I love meeting with folks like you all and kind of talking about how can we serve our communities better. So again, worked mostly in big cities, personally with the city of Chicago, but since joining GFOA, I've worked with lots of smaller organizations as well. So I've gotten to know kind of all facets of local government. I've even worked with like random special districts, like wastewater management districts and things like that. So again, just super passionate about local government. So really excited to be here this evening. So let's jump in. And as the mayor mentioned, if anyone has a question, I think we'll take those as we go. Just raise your hand.
And if I may add to that, we may not, this is a pretty long session today, and there may be questions that you may still have by the end. We can take some of those and I can send them to Ms. Ludwig and then provide written answers back to the council to make sure all your questions are answered. And at the end, if there's additional topics of training that make sense to the commission and the council, definitely something we can take and consider, see how we can provide that so that you feel more comfortable as time goes on with the knowledge and skills you have in these areas.
All right, so we're going to start by talking about budgeting, but before we really dive into that, I wanted to share with you again, I mentioned that our mission is to advance excellence in public finance to support thriving communities. And a few years ago, we developed this framework that we call our Financial Foundations Framework for Thriving Communities. And as you can see there, it's made up of these 5 interrelated pillars. And we organize a lot of our work around these 5 pillars, and really the point here is to show that budgeting and good financial management and financial sustainability are not just a technical exercise. Clearly that's part of it, but that there's other things you need to be doing from an organizational standpoint that are just as important. And so that includes having a long-term vision, right? Like knowing where you want to be as an organization and as a community, and that everyone buys into that and understands what that is. Having trust in open communication, another really big part of that, right? If we're wanting to collaborate together internally with our elected officials, with the department heads, with the public, right? We all need to be trusting one another and talking to one another. And sometimes that's really hard, but we have to work as an organization on that. The next pillar is very much related, which is to use collective decision making, right? It can't just be top down, I say this, so this is what we're going to do. You don't get any buy-in that way, right? We have to kind of bring people into the conversation. Not to say that everything's direct democracy, but that, everyone has input and everyone gets a say in that, and we understand the impact of decisions on different parts of the community and different parts of the organization. The next pillar is to create clear rules. This one sometimes throws people for a loop because they're like, what are you talking about? But what we really mean by this is when we're bringing people together to collaborate around something like financial management or financial sustainability, you can't just get them together and be like, okay, yeah, manage your finances, be financially sustainable. People need to know their roles and their responsibilities. It's hard to hold people accountable if they don't know what their role is and what their responsibility is and what they need to be doing. And this is where financial policies comes in. I think I did review some of your financial policies in your budget. I think you're definitely headed in the right direction there. You've got some really good ones. And it's just important because, again, it sets that standard for accountability, right? When you know sort of what the goal is, what the policy calls for, then you can be held accountable to that. And then the last pillar is to treat everyone fairly. And again, right, all these are connected. But what we mean by treat people fairly is that I think the tagline says under there in the pillar, it says promote and protect mutual trust and respect. So if you're not treating people fairly, again, like obeying the rules that you've outlined, really bringing people into the conversation, all that good work that you've done, maybe building up some of those other pillars kind of gets eroded, right? And kind of goes by the wayside if you're not treating everyone fairly. Doesn't necessarily mean treating everyone the same, right? But at least it means that you are consistently applying criteria and those kinds of things. So that's I can talk like for hours just on these 5 pillars. That was like my 2-minute quick overview, but just wanted to keep that in mind, and I'll call back on it and harken back to it a couple times in the presentation. So moving along to why do we budget, right? Before we get into sort of the how and the what of budgeting, I'm always very big on like, let's really understand why we budget. And for sure, there are lots of different reasons. When I ask this question in the classes I teach, like people always go, well, because we have to, our charter says, or our state says, we have to, legally we have to have a budget. And I know that actually here, you don't actually have to have a budget. You have to have some appropriations, but you don't have to have a budget in the form that you do, but you do it, right? And so we kind of go through an exercise often of like, why do we budget then? What's the value in that? And these are some of the reasons that we think it's really important that you budget. And clearly, legal is up there at the top, but there are lots of other reasons too. And I really like to focus on that last point, that if we really get down to sort of the core purpose, it comes back to trust, and particularly trust with the community, right? That we are putting together a budget to say, this is what we want to do, this is what we've heard are your priorities, this is our plan for building that community that you want and need, and this is how we're going to do it. Now you can hold us accountable to that. And then by reporting out on that, right, that's how we build that trust. So that to me is a really important part of why we do that. But again, all those other bullet points are important parts and kind of get us to that final point. As part of building trust then, right, and if we're thinking about budgeting in the context of building trust, we also want to talk about it as how do we identify problems and develop solutions for those, right? That's a big role of local government in general, right, is to we fix problems in the community, right? We know there are issues, and that's our role to figure out how we're going to solve them. And so when we think about budgeting, which is, there's we think of sort of 3 components here, that it's not just the budgeting and the financial part in the middle, but it's also the planning and policy making that sort of precedes that, right? So that's where we're figuring out, what do we want to be, right? What's that future state that we're trying to achieve from a planning and policy perspective? We all need to be on the same page about that and articulate that. that then informs our budgeting, right? That's when we're going to decide how we're going to spend our resources. We're going to commit them. And then flowing out of that, that's not enough, right? It's not enough just to have the planning, the policymaking, and the budgeting. You also then have to monitor that, right? And report back out and tell people how you're doing, right? Make sure that those commitments you've made, that you're living up to those, and also that you're maintaining an understanding of the environment around you. We live in a really, really dynamic world, and we know that things change. So that's not to say that those plans we make are static. It's not to say that our budget allocations are static, right? We know we have to adapt during the year. And that's what that monitoring is about, is just sort of saying, hey, this is how we're doing, this is what's happening, here's how we're adapting to that. I will say, again, a big part of the monitoring is financial reporting. It's also reporting on, again, goals, performance measures, things like that. I know there was a question that we got about sort of how often and what's a best practice that the GFOA might have around frequency of financial reports, and is that monthly or quarterly? And we don't have a set best practice on that. We don't have anything that says, oh yeah, you absolutely should do it monthly or quarterly. We do think it should be regular, right? There should be some sort of regular monitoring reporting that's happening. But that frequency really needs to be agreed upon by all the stakeholders and sort of memorialized in a policy or a procedure, and then you go from there. But again, no one size fits all in terms of, oh yeah, it should be monthly, it should be quarterly, it should be mid-year. Kind of figure out sort of what works best for you. All right, so let's keep moving here around sort of how we budget. And again, how do we make budget decisions? There's lots of different things that go into that, right? But you can see there we have sort of highlighted in the center that we really do think highlighting collaboration is really important, that everyone within the organization, we're also a big believer in that financial management, financial sustainability is not just the purview of the finance department, right? It's not like we say, oh, yep, anything having to do with the money and the finances, that's just finance and no one else has to worry about that. It really is that everyone in the organization needs to play a role in supporting the financial sustainability of the organization. And again, so that means we have to include a lot of stakeholders in these conversations, right? So again, I could talk all day about stakeholders and different stakeholders and how to communicate with them, keeping it short today. But again, just the importance, and that's why I'm here today, right? Like you all are all important stakeholders, and we want to make sure that you're feeling empowered and informed so that you can, again, play a bigger, better role in this whole process. I don't get to present to elected officials very often, so this is really cool. Just because I'm teaching, folks who work for you all, and they're asking different kinds of questions. So this is really a neat opportunity for me. So let's jump into just an overview of a typical budget process, if there is such a thing even as a typical budget process. But before we even talk about sort of the different steps involved, to me, this is one of our most important best practices. It's actually my favorite budget best practice. And when I say that, I always get a chuckle because people are like, wow, you must be a real special kind of nerd if you have a favorite budget best practice. But yes, this is my favorite budgeting best practice, which is the structurally balanced budget best practice. I've got the link up there. You can read the whole thing, but the crux of it is that you should use recurring revenues on recurring expenditures, right? Another way that we say that is you should only use one-time revenues on one-time expenditures. And I'll talk more here about what do we mean by those. We sort of define some recurring revenues, unstable revenues, and then one-time revenues. So recurring revenue is pretty self-explanatory, right? Revenue that you can generally count on year after year with little variation or really predictable variation, right? And an example, usually for most people, is the property tax. It's pretty stable. You kind of can predict, based on what new development's happening, based on valuations, you can kind of go, okay, we pretty much know what we're going to get. Unstable revenue is the opposite, right? It's revenue that's much more volatile or unpredictable. Examples there are fines or certain transaction or sales taxes. So I always think back to so I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan, don't judge me. But she was traveling the country last year, and if your city got a Taylor Swift concert, your revenue was going through the roof because all your hotels were full, your restaurants were full, all that. But not stable revenue, right? Because Taylor Swift doesn't tour every year. So a really good example of sort of an unstable revenue there. And then one-time revenue, or sometimes we call it non-recurring, is revenue that you really shouldn't expect to receive on a regular basis, right? It's as its name says, right? It's a one time. So often this is different, certain grants. ARPA is a really good example of that. Other forms of intergovernmental assistance or proceeds from selling assets. Maybe you have a vacant building or a vacant piece of land you've sold. Debt is also considered a one-time revenue. And of course, using reserves, right, is another one-time revenue source. So we often will kind of talk about what should we be spending one-time revenue on, right? Any of these things, right? Should we spend one-time revenue on salaries for existing staff or for additional staff, right? Generally, I would say no. But right, for any of these, you could always make the case, right? So for the additional staff, I will tell you, when I was running that big grant program that Chris mentioned, it was a $170 million grant program. I couldn't do that by myself. I needed some people to help me. So I did hire staff with those grant funds, but I hired them under very specific parameters. And when we posted that position, we said, these are time-limited funds. We have this grant for 3 years. And this position will be funded for these 3 years. After that, there's no guarantee of continued funding. So people who were hired into that position were very clear that it was temporary in nature. But yeah, using one-time revenue on other kind of regular things, right? Maintenance, utility bills, training. The training one's interesting. I would say definitely you should not be using one-time revenue for regular vehicle maintenance or utility bills. But training is really interesting because if we have this debate sometimes when I'm teaching this course, and people will say, well, generally I would say, hey, training's probably a good use of one-time revenue, right? If you want to get a group of your staff together and send them to the budget academy or our accounting academy, something like that. But someone once pointed out, well, not if it's ongoing training, right? We all have that training that everyone has to go through every year. That sort of compliance-related training, if that would be then an ongoing expense that we wouldn't be wanting to use one-time revenue for that sort of a thing. But new technology or upgrades to existing technology, right, big projects like that, probably a good use, but just know that most of those projects these days are going to be cloud-based software licenses that will have an ongoing cost associated with them. So those one-time upfront implementation costs totally make sense for one-time revenue, but not those ongoing software licensing costs. And then finally, big capital projects, right? Fire station, library, community center, fill in the blank, right? Probably a good use of one-time revenue, with the caveat that you do have a source to fund any of that. You're going to need to fill those buildings with staff, and those will be ongoing expenses, staff and materials, right? And those kinds of things. So you want to make sure that you do have a source for those. I remember when I worked at the library, I was a director of finance there. The library was a department of the city, and we were at a time where we were building a few new branches, and got into an argument with the budget office because they were convinced that this new branch we were building was actually a replacement of another branch, and why couldn't we just move the staff there? And I'm like, that branch closed 4 years ago that you're talking about. So it's not really, technically it was a replacement, but not really. So I had to fight and make sure that we got new positions for that new library because the budget office just didn't think we needed those people. So everyone needs to be on the same page about that before you start building the building. So then this is, again, just a quick overview of sort of what we would consider to be some of the high-level steps involved in getting a budget approved. And again, you'll see the first step here that we talk about is determining your goals and priorities for the upcoming budget period. What do you want to focus on? I know you all start your budget process that way. I think generally in like the November, December, you all start kind of thinking about that, setting your priorities. Really important, because if you just jump into the budgeting part, you're sort of like, what are we doing, right? What are we funding? What is important to us? So that's an important first step. Then you do, you have to figure out sort of what do we have available to us, right? What does our revenue situation look like? Then we are estimating costs, right? Kind of figuring out what do we want to provide? What kind of service level do we want to provide? Do we have any new programs that we want to try out? All those kinds of things. Then we talk about sort of allocating resources, right? So we've got estimates around what we think we want to do. Now let's start allocating things to that. And that can be iterative, right? That can go back and forth. This is where your budget or finance department is kind of going back and forth with departments. And then you end there with sort of balancing things out, right? Figuring out how are we going to make sure that the resources we have available are equal to our planned expenses. And then summarizing and developing materials. This is kind of where we're talking about communicating our story, right? What do we want to tell everyone? What's the story the message we're trying to get across? And then we present that to the governing body for approval. So that is, again, really high level, and there's a lot involved in all of that. But given our short time together today, that's sort of what we're going to get. But we're going to dive next into long-term financial planning. But I think I'll pause there maybe and see if there are any questions. Great. I will keep going then. So again, we're going to talk about long-term financial planning. And what do we mean there, and why is it important? So again, we're not just talking about forecasting, which is super important, but we also, the long-term financial planning kind of combines forecasting with strategizing, right? So we can identify future challenges and opportunities, help determine any causes of any fiscal imbalances and address them, and develop strategies to secure our future financial sustainability. We do have a best practice on long-term financial planning. Again, there is the link. And again, we recommend that all governments prepare and maintain a long-term financial plan. We think if you're utilizing debt financing, that at least needs to be 5 years or longer than 5 years, but at least 5 years for other kinds of general governments. And we also think this is important, right? That long-term planning is sort of long-term financial planning is the starting point for your capital planning, your developing your operating budget, estimating revenue, and any other kinds of planning processes really should start with the long-term financial planning. Talking through some of the benefits, again, creates a long-term outlook. It really helps diagnose potential risks and causes of fiscal distress. I always feel like when I was working in local government as a finance director and in the budget office, I feel like the main thing was we just did not want any surprises. And I just assume that maybe as elected officials, you all are the same way, that, like the thing you like the least are surprises. And I feel like long-term financial planning kind of helps prevent any surprises, right? You can kind of see what's coming down the road. And maybe, again, it's not a crystal ball, right? We can't predict the future, but we can kind of look at numerous different scenarios to kind of get an idea of what multiple futures might look like, multiple possible futures. Again, it helps stimulate big picture thinking, right? So we're not just stuck in the weeds all the time. provides a tool to evaluate our long-term compliance with our financial policies, right? How are we doing on things like our, fund balance goals, our reserve goals, funding those kinds of things. Again, we can sort of see that over time. Again, it allows for preemptive action. It, again, helps define some parameters for decision making, and again, also helps with just communicating the big picture financial position to other stakeholders, our residents, our taxpayers, rating agencies, bond investors, things like that. We talk about 4 different phases of long-term financial planning. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Mobilization phase, the most important thing I think here in the mobilization phase is that you're doing that preliminary financial analysis that includes that environmental scan, right? So you're kind of seeing what's going on around me, identifying strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, that SWOT analysis, doing a little bit of preliminary revenue and expenditure forecasting. And then the other part I think is really important too in the mobilization phase is that you're identifying your service level preferences, right? So you're figuring out what do we want to provide? What does, police services, what does park services, what does community development services, right? What does that look like for us? What do we want to be providing? Then we move into the analysis phase. And sorry, this is so small, but there's a lot to analyze in the analysis phase, right? You've done that environmental scan. Well, now you're really digging into the environment, right? And we want you to look at your demographics, your land use patterns, what's going on legislatively around you, what's big in terms of public opinion, just understanding all those kind of external things that are happening. What's the population trends looking like? Again, do you have adequate diversity of land use, including revenue positive land uses? What are housing prices looking like? Again, are there any changes in laws on the state or federal level that might impact your financial health? And could, perceptions of the community, right, influence people's willingness to want to live there? We also obviously think you should be analyzing your revenues and expenditures, and a 5 to 10 year outlook is pretty typical. But again, that horizon and how far you forecast out should also match the relevant time horizon to match the issues that you're of the planning process. So, for instance, if you're doing a long-term financial plan because you're thinking of going out to the bond market, you're going to be selling long-term debt. You probably want to be looking out 20 or 30 years because that's what you need to know, what the next 20 to 30 years looks like. So 5 to 10 years probably wouldn't be sufficient. Again, also analyze any debt that you have, and then finally, any financial imbalances that you uncover during this phase. Next phase in long-term financial planning is the decision phase, right? So once we kind of know what things look like, we've uncovered imbalances, we kind of know what's driving those imbalances, we understand what's happening in the environment, we need to figure out what we're going to do about it, right? So you're developing financial strategies, and again, there's going to probably be a mix of strategies, things you're doing in the short term and the long term, things on the cost side and on the revenue side, internal and external things that you're doing, and then both on the technical side and on the political side as well. Again, it's not uncommon for planning and forecasting to identify imbalances, quite common actually. And again, you're identifying strategies. And a lot of the time, this imbalance is unfavorable, right? You're not having enough revenue to support future costs. But if you ever do find yourself on the flip side, you also want to have strategies for that, right? Because otherwise you're going to have a lot of surplus going forward and you're not going to know how to deal with that. And that can also be an issue, with the community as well, right? So also need a strategy if you do find yourself facing that kind of a situation. We should be so lucky though, right? And then finally, the last phase of long-term financial planning is the execution, right? So we've developed our strategies. We're going to execute that plan through our budgeting, right? And we're going to, again, take that information we've developed, those strategies we've developed, and execute them through our budgeting. Also want to, again, engage in regular monitoring of that and update the plan, right? It shouldn't just be something that sits on a shelf and gets gathers dust. It is a dynamic document that should be updated regularly. And again, monitoring can happen monthly or quarterly, and updates made as needed. Again, we strongly encourage you, right, to consider out what are the indicators that are most important to you, kind of figure out a scorecard or other kind of visualization to communicate that information. Last thing that we want to mention, though, about long-term financial planning, the forecast is not the main goal, right? A forecast provides information, but really the goal of this is to use that information on possible alternate financial futures and develop options to get to where you want to go in the future. All right, let's keep moving. We're going to talk about reserves and the role of reserves. So this is probably our most cited best practice is fund balance guidelines for the general fund. It's probably my least favorite best practice, though. So let's get into what this says. So first, I'll go over this really quickly. Many of you probably know this. You actually outline this really well in all of your financial documents. You get into these definitions. Again, fund balance is quite simply just your assets minus your liabilities. And for planning and budgeting purposes, fund balance is representing accumulated surpluses. It's resources that are available outside of the current revenue to support government. But again, due to differences in GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, and the budgetary basis of accounting, there could be differences in your GAAP fund balance and the number you would use for budgeting purposes. Just fund balance categories as outlined and defined by generally accepted accounting principles. There's 5 different categories. They range from the most restrictive to the least restrictive. This might look familiar to you because, again, all of your financial documents sort of outline this. Generally, we would call, so the non-spendable is things like inventory, right? It's not money, it's not cash. And then there's restricted, which have some sort of outside a restriction placed upon them. This is often grants or other kinds of funds that you can only use for limited purposes, often with, again, a legal restriction. And then the other 3 types, committed, assigned, and unassigned, we got really creative with the name here. It's unrestricted. So restricted and unrestricted. I mean, Gatsby went a little crazy there with the naming. But those 3 buckets, again, are together called unrestricted. And again, there's differences there between committed and assigned that they are, but I always think about committed as assigned almost as cousins, because one is sort of committed would mean you have it's probably something you all have voted on to say this is a pot of money for a particular purpose. And assigned is a little bit softer, right? It's just sort of saying, hey, we're putting these funds towards this purpose, but there might not be a legislative action supporting that. And then unassigned is exactly that. It just is sitting there. So what does our best practice recommend exactly when it comes to the right amount of fund balance? Well, again, we say you should have a policy on your unrestricted fund balance and the amount that should be maintained in the general fund. That guideline should be set by the policy body and articulate a framework and process for how you would increase or decrease that level, right? So you set a goal. If you go above that goal, this is what happens. If you go below it, this is how we're going to replenish it. It also should provide broad guidance on how resources will be directed to replenish the fund balance if it does fall below a prescribed level. We really, again, just encourage governments to be savvy in how any excess fund balances are used, right? Those are one-time resources, so use them on one-time costs. So what's the right amount, though, right? That's what everyone wants to know. What's the appropriate level of fund balance, the big question? And again, our short answer is it really does depend. And you should take into account each government's own unique circumstances. For instance, if the government is really vulnerable to natural disasters, it might be more dependent on a volatile revenue source or is likely to experience cuts in state aid or federal grants. You may want to maintain a higher level of fund balance. And again, if you outline those kinds of risks in your policy, that makes it easier to explain to your stakeholders why your organization has a certain amount of fund balance. But the shortcut target level, we do say in our policy that it's to maintain 2 months of regular general fund operating revenues or expenditures. And we say you can choose either one. But for some organizations, again, I worked for the city of Chicago, which was really, really big, and 2 months of general regular fund operating revenues would have been a lot of money that would have made very little sense for the city just to keep sitting around in a pot somewhere without any particular use. And then for other really small governments, 2 months is like nothing, right? You can think about like a small fire district or something that has, a $2 million budget or something. They keep around two months worth of operating expenditures. It's so little as to be kind of worthless. So again, the 2 months works for a lot of folks, but we say it's sort of like if you haven't done any sort of risk analysis or you're not sure what you need, go with the 2 months. But we really do encourage folks to kind of think more about, again, their risks, which is what we're going to talk about next. Sort of thinking about reserves as insurance. Again, we've talked a little bit about what reserves are, but in a big way, reserves are really protection against unplanned, unavoidable costs. And we've got a different kind of mental model for reserves. Again, mental model is just a way to make complex things a little bit more simple. So the traditional mental model for reserves in local government we often talk about is the savings account, right? Finance directors have often used this sort of analogy because it's easy to grasp and there's parallel to many of us in our personal lives, right? We can say, hey, we're setting this money aside for a particular purpose and we're saving up. And that works for some of our reserves, but not for all of them. The savings account as a mental model is limited because savings is most often commonly seen as deferred spending, right? The point is you're eventually going to spend it, right? You're not just saving it to save it, you're saving it for a particular purpose. And it generally implies then that more is better, right? The more we build up, the better. But that isn't always the case. So we say we have come up with an alternative sort of mental model, which is to think about reserves as an insurance policy, right? A reserve helps to manage volatility. Risk is a product of volatility. And so again, those reserves are helping to manage risk. This is another parallel, right, in our lives. Many of us pay for insurance in various forms: car insurance, home insurance, umbrella policies, all those kinds of things. And it really then gets us thinking about how we can also use commercial insurance to sort of complement our reserves. And also, we all know that there's an optimal amount of insurance, right? We've all done that kind of work and figured out, well, if I want to pay this amount in deductible and I want this amount of insurance, and we do that kind of analysis and we figure out what works best for us. And we can do that in our organizations as well and kind of figure out there is an optimal amount when we kind of think about the different risks that we're subject to. We can, again, we're not just sort of guessing at what an amount might be, but we can really get to what an optimal amount is. So how do we do that? We'll get into that more in a minute, but I do want to say we are, again, we think that we can get to the best decisions if we think about some of our reserves as insurance, some of our reserves, right? We think about our capital reserves are probably the best example, right? If you're funding your capital projects with cash, you then have to build that capital reserve up. So that is where the savings account analogy mental model really does become more helpful. We put both of those together, and that's where we get to the sort of the best decisions about the use of those funds. I've got two perspectives on risks that I just want to kind of put out there, right? And the perspective one is that our reserves are too low, and we're unable to respond in some sort of emergency situation, whatever that might be. And then there's a second perspective that's says, well, the risk is that our reserves are too high and we're missing an opportunity to fund other things, right? We've got an opportunity cost there, and these funds are sitting in our reserves when they could be put to other use. So again, performing a risk analysis can help you kind of figure out what that Goldilocks just right amount of reserves is. And I'm going to talk through a couple of different ways to do that. So one of the first things we recommend is to think of reserves as a range. And often we think of them as a single point, right? Our policy is we're going to have X percent, 20%, 25%, 30%, whatever that is, right? We're going to hit this number. But if you kind of switch that thinking to say our policy is to maintain reserves in a range, right? So between 15% and 25%. Again, knowing that there is uncertainty, there is volatility, all those kinds of things. This range just doesn't pin us down to just one number. Why is that important? Again, it recognizes you need a margin of error to manage risks. It does accommodate different risk appetites. I think, right, if we were kind of to go around and do a survey, probably everyone here has a slightly different risk appetite, and having that range, you can kind of accommodate that. It does better support strategic long-term thinking, but it still provides a clear floor and ceiling, right? You're still sort of, hey, within a range there, right? We don't want less than this or more than X. Just have an example here of one local government that has, they call this their golden cone of prosperity. So they know that uncertainty increases the further you go out in time. So they wanted to, they widen that range as they go out. So they want, here this is going back to fiscal year 09. So 09, they were at 25%, but they recognize that over time, because they can't totally predict the future, as long as they were in that range over time, they felt like they were in a good spot. So they would report out on this to the public and to their council and kind of predict what that where their fund balance was headed over time, their unassigned fund balance. So how do you arrive at your range, right? What is okay, Katie, you want us to do a range. How should we figure out what the right range for us is? And we've sort of outlined here 3 different methods you could use. And the first is qualitative method. And we actually have a link to a template. The link is upcoming on another slide. But we've got a template that you can use to do this. But it's a really accessible approach. Just kind of asks you to kind of go through, rank the different risks that you're subject to from very high to very low. It can get, you can include lots of different people from the organization in this. We've had lots of local governments that we've worked with to kind of do this, get a group of people together, again, go through, use our template, and you can kind of see, again, identify different risks in different areas. It's pretty easy. It gets people thinking about risks. Again, the con here is the risks. This is subjective, right? And errors can creep in. But again, it's a good start if you've never kind of embarked on this kind of risk-based reserve analysis. The next approach would be a quantitative approach using a single number. And the example we have here is if you wanted to think about recession risk, right? You could kind of go back and look at an analog, like the 2008 recession. That was a pretty bad one. My city's losses were 5 million. So, okay, like if we put aside 5 million for the next, that should be sufficient for our next future recession. Again, it's using history and analogs to estimate potential loss. Very accessible, pretty simple, but again, risks are uncertain and single numbers can be misleading. But again, it's a next step you could take. We've also got a report here that kind of talks through an example. I can't remember what city this is. Oh, Colorado Springs. We worked on a project with them. And then the latest and greatest that we've been doing is quantitative chance-based analysis. This is similar to methods used by insurance companies. Risk is not just a single number, but there's a full range of variation. There are a lot of really cool technology tools available today that make this possible. Excel, you can do amazing things with Excel these days, more than just the pivot tables and like simple formulas that I know how to use. Again, there's just a lot of ways you can kind of use those to do really sophisticated statistical analysis that can give you a really good estimate of your reserve range. The con here is it does require a little bit of special training and sometimes some consulting support. Not always, though. Again, if you've got folks on the inside who are just master Excel users, like they can figure this out. But my colleague, Shane Kavanaugh, has done a lot of this, goes out and works with a lot of governments to kind of do this sort of chance-based risk reserve analysis. It involves sort of doing this Monte Carlo analysis. Again, it's really cool statistical tools out there. Yeah.
I want to start with one basic question and then
Sure.
Councilmember Risto. You described unassigned fund balances and then you've described reserves.
Yep.
What's the relationship between those
Great.
two?
That is a great question. I think of unassigned fund balance as really a very technical accounting term. And on the budget side, I really think we should talk about reserves and use that term because there is like from GASB, right? There are those very specific definitions about what unassigned fund balance is. Reserves, again, they're related, but I would say reserves, again, when we're talking about budgeting, that is probably the better term to be using. And again, implying that there is a purpose related to them, right? That we're putting aside reserves for some sort of, they're not just sitting there, right? Like it's not just some surplus that, oops, we kind of had at the end of the year, that we've designated these reserves for a particular purpose.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Risto.
Thank you. I don't want to use a super scary example, but when you're talking about, the quantitative chance space, like for reserves, in 1989, we had the earthquake and there was a lot of damage in the community and probably an impact on sales tax and other things while downtown businesses were closed. So what I was thinking about is when you think about an incident that can happen, like we didn't anticipate COVID and what impacts that would have, we know that there's a chance of another earthquake. We also know how vulnerable our buildings and our structures are in general. So is that how the chance plays into it? Or you look at wildfire and say, what are the chances that it'll wipe out the entire community or part of the community or some of the roads?
Yep, that's exactly. So again, I mentioned my colleague we have partnerships with different insurance companies. We look at FEMA data. We get data from all different kinds of places and kind of feed that into these simulations to kind of figure out what could that look like. Again, in terms of what's the likelihood of it happening and what is the projected, the scale of the damage that would result. So Yeah, there's, and again, we sit with you, kind of walk through all those, what are those particular things? Because it's different everywhere, right? What those risks are. But yeah, there's again, we have access to a lot of data that can help inform that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Rennie?
I'm not sure how much this is a question versus a conversation starter, but do you have more guidance on the forecasting? I think that's the weakness in this whole thing from, I've been at this for 10 years, so 10 budgets, and we manage, in my opinion, we manage our risk here by giving forecasts that, in my words, I would say are 95% confident that we won't be worse than that kind of thing. So we have, forecasts that say, well, we're pretty close to break even, or we might even lose money this year, and then we never do. And when you start piling that onto a 5-year forecast, it turns into something ridiculous. And so I've been here for, I'd say, like 10 years. For the last 7 years, I've been looking at 5-year forecasts that said, in 3 years, we're going negative. We've never gone negative yet in those 7 years, even though we've had these 5-year forecasts that say, what I see you pointing to is we should be managing our risks by looking at fund balances versus this over-conservative forecasting. What I didn't see in here is much guidance on how to do forecasting, and I tend to think of it as a confidence level. It's not going to be worse. We've got 95% confidence. Well, that might be overdoing it. Maybe we should have a 75% confidence level. It's not going to be worse than this. And then apply our risk management in the funds here. You had the cone picture that showed the fund balance going down over time. Well, if you put our 5-year forecast on that, we're through the floor. But I know that's not going to happen because over 10 years I've never seen it happen. So really what I'm suggesting is some more guidance on how to connect correct forecasting to these other risk management tools you're kind of pointing to
Sure.
here.
Yeah. No, that's a great, I loved your point about the inner confidence intervals as well, because we are trying to get, we have done a little bit of work on that and trying to get people, we've done training where we're trying to get people to speak in that language even, and stop using, when I teach a lot of courses around budget communication and, words like approximately or about or almost and things like that, can be, there's just wildly different interpretations sometimes of what that means. So, it sounds weird, right? When I go, well, I'm 80% confident that I am going to do X or Y or Z, but actually that's more helpful, right? It's much more helpful if I can put it into those kinds of precise language. So that is a great point. And the other thing we often talk about, and maybe I probably didn't focus on it enough, is in the forecasting, it also can be really helpful. I obviously always state your assumptions, right? How are you getting, to the numbers you're getting at? What are the underlying assumptions? And also maybe considering 2 or 3 alternate scenarios, right? There, you can, very basic, you can have a rosy scenario, a middle of the road scenario, a negative scenario or whatnot, and kind of looking at what all those might be. I saw one long-term forecast once where this town was trying to attract a Walmart and they had 2 versions of sales tax, if we get the Walmart, if we don't get the Walmart, right? Very basic, but was very helpful for them to kind of see the impact of what that would look like. So I guess those would be 2 things is, again, we're right there with you in terms of being more precise in language and then also looking at different scenarios in the forecasting.
Right.
Okay. We're, I guess, about a little over a third through the material. I'm going to see if we could hold our break until 7. Is that okay? Okay. So let's keep going. Thanks.
Great. So this is just really quickly, it's more in here as kind of FYI, but a reserve policy checklist to again, encourage you all to put in place a reserve policy. Again, a checklist there, and then some additional resources, including that template I mentioned, of the full paper on should we rethink reserves, and that calculation tool I mentioned, that Excel workbook as well. Capital planning and asset maintenance. Let's talk about that. This is one of my favorites. So first, to start out with, we are big proponents of having a balanced capital improvement plan, or CIP, as opposed to a wish list. And what do I mean there? So a balanced CIP would say, let's say my CIP is 5 years. I'm going to estimate over the 5 years what resources I think I'm going to have available for capital projects. Let's say that's in the $100 million. So then I am going to budget and plan for spending $100 million worth of projects over that 5 years. Some local governments that I talk to, they approach capital planning in a different way. And it just is this long laundry list of stuff that they want in their community. And there's all these projects, and it's deferred maintenance, and it's all this kind of, and their capital plan is just this long list of projects. And they might break it up into years, but it doesn't really, it's not really meaningful. They haven't really thought about what they think they're going to have available. It's just sort of a list of projects that they want. So we are very much sort of saying, hey, you should have a balanced CIP, as opposed to taking that wish list approach. I know we did have a question sort of about how we should plan for, again, multi-year capital projects, and particularly sometimes when projects have grant funding attached with them, and we might not know if that grant's going to come through, sort of how should we approach that? So again, we think, no wish list CIPs, really estimate what you think you're going to have available and plan that out. And if you have a project that, is a $10 million project and you think that's going to take 3 years, you kind of spread that, cost out. This is also where sort of project planning comes in. What do we think we're going to need in each of those 3 years? I find in my experience that generally those projects move slower rather than quicker. So, but just think about, again, what are your needs going to be? And if you're planning that out, let's say it's 3 million, and then, what did I say? It was a $10 million project? I think that was the number I used. Yeah, so 3, and then 4. Right, know that if that project moves quicker than anticipated, you're going to need to kind of move some things around. But yeah, that's generally sort of how would we approach that. And then I think the question about sort of how then the grant funding comes in, and should we start a project if we don't have the grant funding committed, I think that really also comes down to understanding and agreeing on what your risk appetite is, and how much uncertainty you're willing to accept, right? So like whether or not you're going to get that grant is an uncertainty, it's a risk. And also thinking about sort of how much of a priority is that project, right? There could be really good reasons that, hey, no matter what, this project needs to happen. We really want to get that grant, but we need to get started on it. We'll make it happen no matter what. Or if it's not, that's not the case, we're going to wait until we have a little bit more certainty. We feel better. This is a lower risk, and then we'll get started. But again, for me, it does come back to that sort of risk appetite. We do strongly encourage, though, that as you are, because we want you to have a balanced CIP and not just a wish list, that you're going to need to figure out what you're going to fund. And to do that, we strongly encourage you to utilize objective criteria and have a policy that says, hey, we're going to make our project selections using objective criteria, and list out what those might be. These are just some possible criteria. I know some places that I've seen in policies that they prioritize projects that are going to enhance the economic development opportunities, have high economic impact, those kinds of things. Others also make sure that they want to understand the operating impact, right? And that becomes another criteria. If there are significant operating impacts that we don't have funded, right, those kind of move to the bottom of the list. Again, just a little bit about operating budget impacts. Those, again, can have a significant impact on the operating budget, things like maintenance and staffing. Again, you really need to consider those upfront and incorporate that kind of review of the operating budget impacts in your policies. Just some examples of operating impacts. And again, the big thing here too is none of these are eligible for capital financing, right? We are going to need to have an ongoing source identified for those. And then asset maintenance is also a big part of this. Strongly encourage local governments to create an inventory of assets and their condition and to reconcile that with any documentation that they have. And then also establish a capital maintenance program for all assets in service, and then to really dedicate funding for maintenance, whether that's in your operating budget or in your capital improvement plan, could be either place. Again, but a big part, in fact, I know some folks that prioritize maintenance projects in their CIP, that they sort of will state that they're going to care for the assets they have before they introduce new assets into their inventory. That was my quick overview on CIP, but now we're going to talk a little bit about funding the CIP. We really have two main sources of funding. We're going to either utilize debt in some way or allocate current resources, which we call pay-as-you-go or pay-go for short. And these sources can be capital reserves, one-time resources, earmarking portions of certain regular revenue streams, or establishing dedicated revenue streams. This is most common, though, in like an enterprise operation, a water utility, for instance. They might have a surcharge on every bill or something that goes towards capital improvement projects. So kind of as we're thinking through these two, advantages and disadvantages of pay-go really quick. Enhances your fiscal responsibility, right? You're not paying for more than what you can afford. Gives you increased flexibility then down the road. If for some reason you do need to go to the debt market, you have that opportunity. Again, it enhances that future borrowing. There are some questions about intergenerational equity when we think about pay-go. If we're using cash resources today for, say, something like a park that's going to be used, over the next 50 years, has a useful life of 50 years, those taxpayers of 20, 30 years down the road didn't contribute, to creating that park 20 years ago. Again, there's a flip side argument with intergenerational equity, though, and using too much debt, right? Because then we're saddling those future taxpayers with too much. So we often talk about kind of finding that healthy balance. And then the last point here, of course, is opportunity cost, right? If we're spending $1 on a capital project, means we're not spending it on something else. So can we pay as we use or fund things with debt financing? Again, the main sources there are general obligation bonds or revenue bonds, which are not guaranteed. Sometimes we see capital leases. Again, less often, but sometimes see those. And again, same questions there. Well, flip side question about intergenerational equity there. Some advantages of debt, fiscal practicality, funding security. Again, it can reduce pressure on your operating funds for sure. Gives you flexibility within your operating budget, and the funding that is aligned with the asset's useful life, and again, allows you to leverage your current cash for bigger impact. But it It does require a strong commitment to long-term planning. No one's going to lend you money if they don't know that you can pay it back long-term. And they are really, really financially complex deals, as you all probably know. Lots of folks getting involved in that. They can also be expensive because there are lots of different financial professionals involved. So how do we decide? Again, long-term planning, long-term projections is the key. Looking at different scenarios as well, and understanding your policies, guidelines, what constraints you have. And then finally, don't forget to look at your debt policy. And I did look at your debt policy, which I think was in your budget. I looked at a lot of your financial documents over the past week, so I'm trying to keep everything straight. But I think this was in your budget that I saw it. So yeah, you guys had really good, had a lot of this kind of outlined in there. All right, gonna shift into managing financial distress. We've got a 12-step program that we call Fiscal First Aid. We originally developed this Fiscal First Aid program in response to the Great Recession, so in like 2009, 2010. And then in 2020, when the COVID pandemic hit and shut a lot of the economy down, we said, hey, we've got really good resources that can help people. Why don't we kind of update those, dust them off, update them, refresh them, because that can be really helpful to folks right now. So that's what we did. So again, kind of updated and developed this 12-step program. I'm not going to go through all 12 steps. I'm really going to focus on steps 5, which is our near-term treatments, step 6, the detailed diagnosis, and then step 8, which are the longer-term treatments. So step 5, we're going to talk about, again, a lot of our near-term treatments. These are things that you can kind of make progress on in the next year, and in some cases, these things will resolve, a lot of your minor cases of financial distress, but for really severe cases, they help you buy time. Everything I'm going to talk about, we have a set of papers that we wrote, again, back in 2020, called Balancing the Budget in Bad Times. We had part 1 and part 2. And so everything I'm going to talk about is in more detail in those papers. I want to talk first about sort of setting the stage and things. I'm going to talk about specific treatments we can use, but we also kind of talk about sort of organizational culture, things you want to focus on. And one of the first things we say is like when you're in kind of severe financial distress, you really need to send that message that every dollar counts. Because people need to know, right? Like that we are in financial distress, and they need to know that the things they're doing are going to help contribute and help get us out of financial distress. So we say you need to establish this culture of frugality. And this picture of the gentleman with the lawnmower here is kind of a story going back to the Great Recession. There was a small town somewhere in the Midwest that the mayor actually canceled the lawn service contract for City Hall because he was like, I'm going to get out there and I'm going to cut the grass, the City Hall lawn every week. Now, now this wasn't saving a ton of money, right? It's not like, oh, they were going to balance the budget on this one lawn mowing contract. But it was sending the message to the community and to the employees and to the rest of the organization to say, hey, everyone's chipping in here and I'm not above like doing whatever I need to do to help out with that. I remember when I worked at, when I was a budget analyst in Chicago in around 2001, 2002, we were having to make a bunch of cuts to the budget. This is right after September 11th. And we went through, and this is when we were still doing budget with like red pen and paper, And we had to cut out any instance where we saw in our department's budget that they were purchasing bottled water, like, you know, the water coolers. They had contracts, right, that they would have the water guy come every week. And we were like, nope, we're cutting those out. Again, we were not going to balance the budget on this, but this was sort of our way of like sending the message like, nope, this is a perk that like we're cutting out because we had to like let everyone, you know, establish this culture of frugality. I think to this day, like no department has bottled water at the city of Chicago, by the way. It's stuck. But other things you can kind of do to send that message is like get rid of like perks, like folks who have individual printers at their desk, folks who have take-home vehicles or vehicle allowances, things like that, like cutting back on a lot of those things can, again, sort of send that message that every dollar counts. But an important complement to that is also a focus on results, right? So we want to value input results over just inputs and outputs, right? So if we want to, an example of this would be to focus on improving perceptions of public safety, right? That's the result. And we should focus on that rather than just focusing on the number of police officers, which is an input, right? Or the number of patrols, which is an output. Because if we define success simply as inputs and outputs in a time of cutback, we're never going to be winning then, right? We're always going to be we're never going to be successful because we're going to likely have to be cutting a lot of those inputs and outputs. Again, if we think about results as the definition of success and we figure out how, you know, what are the kind of results we're looking for, then again, it kind of opens up and unlocks some creativity for folks to think about, again, what are some more cost-effective ways to achieve that same result. And then another complement to all of this is to be willing to spend money to save money, right? We don't want to be overly frugal, right? Overly simplistically frugal, because we don't want to make penny-wise, pound-foolish decisions, right? So sometimes it is necessary to spend money on some cost-saving innovations or technology. So examples might be, again, some sort of new labor-saving technology. I don't know whether that's related to cashiering or, you know, could be any number of things. But again, not being afraid to spend money to save money where we think we're going to that investment could help. This next one I really like too, to think about how we're going to frame the financial crisis that we're in or the financial distress that we're in. And there's kind of two different ways that you can frame a crisis. And one I think is pretty productive and the other one is destructive. And so the first one we have here I think is the more destructive way, which is sort of a siege or a bunker mentality, right? It's just sort of we say, hey, we're going to hunker down, we're in distress, but if we just hold tight, we'll be fine. We'll get through this. This too shall pass, right? We're just going to sort of hunker down, no worries. We don't need to do anything differently. We'll get through it. Again, it kind of favors the status quo. It stifles innovation. It doesn't get us to kind of think how we might do things differently going forward. So again, the flip side is to see the crisis or the financial distress as an opportunity. This crisis can sort of produce a game-changing events, right, that can be used to break free of events or practices that were kind of constraining us in the past, right? If this idea that, I love this quote, like, don't let a crisis go to waste, right? If you're facing something, it really can be something bad, something stressful. It can be a way to, again, think about how you will do things differently going forward. Let's jump into some of these treatments. And we've got a lot of treatments related to personnel budgeting, and then some to non-personnel as well. But the other thing I really want to point out here is that a lot of these practices, they're just good financial management practices, and you don't need to wait for any kind of crisis or time of financial distress to use these things. Like, they're just kind of good general practices that can help. And the first one of these is vacancy control, which is I think is something that you all have started doing recently. But what we mean here is like it's different from a hiring freeze, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we're just saying, hey, the default isn't going to be when there's a vacancy, we automatically fill it. We're going to kind of do a review and we're going to say, do we need to fill that vacancy at the same level, at the same rate, at the same title? Do we have to do it now? Could we do it in 3 months? Could we do it in 6 months? But that there's going to be a review of every vacancy before we just automatically fill it. I will tell you, when I worked at the city of Chicago, and I believe to this day, they operate under vacancy control 24/7, like all year round, good times and bad. They've had a lot of bad times recently, but we won't talk about that. Again, because it's just sort of this, like, it's a healthy self-skepticism, I think, of just to sort of say, hey, do we still need this position, or is there a different way that we could get this done going forward? After each of these slides, I have sort of some key questions. I'm going to skip over these. This is just sort of like if you are using this tool or this treatment, some things you would want to think about. I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail there, though, in the interest of time. Next treatment, though, is to monitor and limit, if you can, overtime use. This is kind of just saying, hey, understand what's driving your overtime. Can you control that, right? What is the root cause of your overtime? And then, trying to determine, right, do we have an opportunity to cut that? Can we create different schedules to create less need for overtime? Could we use part-time employees to fill some of those gaps? Could we use more junior level full-time employees? Who's mostly getting this overtime, and is there sort of like a management issue there, right? Are there some folks who just consistently have that overtime, and do they really need to be using overtime, right? Is there some other issue going on? Are there special projects that are driving a lot of that overtime, and can we defer some of those? And then again, what are our policies around that, right? Do we have policies around how overtime gets approved, how it's used, all those kinds of things? If we don't have those, let's put those in place as well. Healthcare costs, big one for a lot of local governments because they are rapidly increasing. Ways to look at cost, looking at cost reduction without reducing employee benefits. Is there an opportunity to rebid insurances? Conducting an eligibility audit can sometimes prove fruitful. Like there might be folks who, again, are no longer eligible but are still on their rolls. Looking at that. Looking at implementing a cafeteria plan. Seeing what opportunities there are to control prescription drug costs. Hiring an employee healthcare concierge, that can sometimes be helpful. It's also kind of a benefit sometimes to your employees, but can also then help them find the most cost-effective providers and treatments and things like that. And then potentially looking at a healthcare co-op. I would say this is potentially one of those areas when we talk about spending money to saving money, like bringing in a consultant to help you think through some of this sometimes can be helpful because a lot of this gets very technical. But one thing to think about. Moving on to some of the non-personnel, again, these are still the near-term treatments. Enhancing purchasing practice, looking at how you can create more competition, managing contracts better. Sometimes I think about, making sure we know when contracts are expiring, who's using contracts, is there more than one department using the contract? Could we, we have 2 departments with 2 separate contracts for similar services. Could we combine that next time? Like that, all those kinds of things. Just are there opportunities for doing that? Sometimes the answer is no, but it's worth looking into. Similarly, reviewing ongoing expenditures. This one's pretty simple, and again, just one of those like, probably should just always be doing this, right? But auditing routine expenditures and looking if we do see a lot of kind of looking at our risk management practices, workers' comp claims, right? Is that a large cost driver for us, or are those going up? And again, seeing what we could do to control some of that. Next category here is sort of has to do with how we might just do things differently, right? Pool resources, partner, so cooperating with other governments to achieve economies of scale. So I've working on a conference session actually where there's in Pennsylvania, in around Pittsburgh, there were some small boroughs that needed finance help, right? They needed like a finance director, but none of them on their own could like afford an FTE. So they kind of, the three of them banded together and they hired an FTE to be sort of a finance director for multiple boroughs. So those kinds of things, right? How can you find those economies of scale? Or within your organization, could you pool resources better between departments? And then again, are there opportunities to partner with any private organizations or with citizens to provide services as well? Better managing capital spending, equipment costs, debt, those kinds of things. Again, better aligning capital financing with any project schedules. It's a little bit of what we were talking about earlier as well, right? Making sure that we're planning those schedules as accurately as we can. Developing an equipment replacement schedule, that's just a best practice all around, right? You shouldn't be waiting for financial distress for that. Same with using long-term capital improvement planning, right? Helps you make long-term decisions better, but also near-term decisions. And then if you have any opportunities to refinance debt, always explore those.
Before we move into
Yeah.
revenue enhancement, maybe we could take a 10-minute break.
Sounds great.
7 o'clock, come back at 7:10, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
let's get started again. And again, there's opportunity for questions, but why don't we move into the revenue enhancement piece, and then we'll take any questions. Thanks.
All righty. So we're gonna talk about options to enhance revenue that you could try. And one of those is to obtain federal or state or provincial aid. Opportunities for that these days are kind of slim. Lots of uncertainty at the federal level, but worth exploring. Looking at fees for services, if you're not already using fees for services, exploring that, or even looking at cost recovery goals. Are we recovering enough of our cost? And should we increase any of our fees? New taxes, looking at new taxes with a strong connection to a desired service. We have that other, that last piece on there because our research does show that taxes are more likely to have public support when you can show a clear connection to whatever service you're trying to fund. So whether that's, education enhancements, homeless services, fill in the blank, right? Whatever the thing is that you want to do more of, showing a connection between whatever this new tax is, maybe it's an extra % on sales tax or something like that, but showing that connection, again, much more likely to get public support. Looking at opportunities to improve billing or collection procedures. Sometimes there's something there. Sometimes there is some additional revenue you can collect. Not always though. Sometimes, right, your collection rates are pretty good. So can kind of look at that. And then auditing your tax revenue sources. I think y'all are probably already doing that, but some places don't do that on a regular basis. And so saying, check that out, make sure you're not, missing out on any potential revenue. So we'll move now into the part 2 of our series of papers here, and these are some additional near-term treatments, but these are the sort of what we would call more cautionary.
If I could, Vice Mayor has a question.
Oh,
Thank
sure.
you, Mayor.
Sorry
Yeah, sorry.
about that.
No. I just, while we're on the topic of revenue, I
Oh,
wanted
sure.
to ask. So I think for, and I know you won't be able to speak to all of the particulars of Los Gatos, but for a town like Los Gatos that has what, is sometimes referred to as a structural deficit, do you have thoughts on some of the best practices where, I think it would seem that in some ways we would need to look at revenue measures, tax measures and things like that. And so do you have sort of best practices on what kinds of measures are, you talked about, drawing a line to services, but I think part of our struggle is that we have it's not a particular part of our budget that has, ballooned or whatever that is causing the issue. It's costs have risen across the board.
You need just more general
Right,
sources.
right.
Sure. Yeah, a couple of things. I think we would say always, obviously, working really closely with your elected body and with the public, right? Because a big part of that is going to be understanding what they will support. So that is going to be always the number one thing is, close coordination, collaboration with your elected body and with getting the public feedback as well. But yeah, we would often say looking at sales tax, property tax, and then those fees for service, right? Are you collecting as much as you could be, right? Is there opportunity there for increasing some of those? Should we look at a model where, a lot of folks are going to, their fees for service are now on an automatic escalator tied to CPI, so you don't have to come back and, that's just kind of on a set it and forget it, if you will, right? Kind of a thing. I had another thought though, and it just escaped me. Oh, I'll use my own county as an example. They recently instituted a an additional 4% restaurants, like so eating prepared meals out. So we currently had 6% that the state collects on all of that. Counties do have the option to go up to 10%. And my county, because they were seeing, I live in Virginia where the counties fund the schools, and the schools costs were really, really increasing. So they did another additional 4% to increase that. People didn't love it, but right, those are the trade-offs that need to be made. But I do think a big part of that is communication and like showing the need, right? Like what, and talking about service, not just talking about this in terms of dollars and cents, but also talking about it in terms of service levels and need and those kinds of things. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Other questions? All right. So again, we're moving into these more cautionary treatments, and just some important things to keep in mind before we would recommend that you do any of these as sort of, do we have the authority? If we don't have the authority, what can we do to get the authority, right? Do we need to go out for voter approval? Do we need to go to the state legislature? The city of Chicago has been talking for years. In the state of Illinois, services aren't taxed, right, with sales tax, right? If I get my hair cut or get my nails done, like no sales tax paid on that. The city of Chicago has been talking for years and years about should we, that could be a significant source of additional revenue. More people, we're more of a service-based economy these days. Should we do that? They don't have the authority to do that without going to the state legislature, though, right? So that's been on their legislative agenda for a few years. So just an example. Again, potential financial benefit, the impact on services, how feasible is the implementation, and again, will our elected officials support it? Because, and again, this idea of service impact, these things that we're talking about here about cutting our budget, there will be impacts to services, right? There's not always the opportunity to do more with less. Often we're talking about doing less with less. So again, we're just always caution that you need to think about that. How can you mitigate those impacts, and how can you make sure you're gathering public input on sort of what is acceptable? And then also not ignoring the political feasibility, right? We recognize that our elected officials don't have this unending pot of political capital. You all may have to take unpopular steps, and that, again, we need to appreciate that and work with our elected officials on that. So we're going to jump into, again, these are our cautionary treatments. So the things I talked about earlier were like, those were the no-brainers. Like, you should just be doing them. Those are good practices. These are things that, again, might make a lot of sense for you, but need to be done so knowing that there are risks associated with them. And the first is, that we're going to talk about is a layoff, or otherwise known as a reduction in force. Right? This is where we're talking about eliminating positions from the organization. This can get you significant cost savings, not just one time, but going forward as well. They are a huge morale killer, right? Like, this is really, really difficult. I've lived through a few rounds of layoffs in my time. They are awful. They're awful for the people who get laid off. They're awful for the people who remain behind. And again, they will affect your service delivery as well. Again, I've got these key questions, these slides. I'm going to go through those pretty quickly, but the one thing I want to mention on this one is if you are ever looking at a layoff, making sure that you do have the full accounting of savings and costs. There will be costs associated with that as well, one-time separation payments, possible unemployment insurance, things like that. Wage freeze is next. This kind of just says, hey, we're not paying anyone, we're not giving any raises, we're not giving any increases. It doesn't reduce compensation, but it's just saying we're not going to let this grow anymore. This is really difficult, if not impossible, to enact in a collective bargaining environment. It can also lead to your best people leaving and makes it really hard to recruit folks as well. And again, this is not what we would call a really results-oriented, data-driven approach. It's kind of a blunt instrument and is just sort of saying, hey, this is sort of an across-the-board thing that we're going to do. And sometimes, again, you have no other choice, but just need to know those risks headed into it. Hiring freeze is the next one, which is, again, sort of we would call that a blanket stop on all or almost all hiring. And you are going to have to make exceptions in a hiring freeze, and that sometimes decreases the internal support for it because people start to go, well, that's not fair. Like they did get to hire, I'm not getting to hire, right? It gets really difficult in that sense. But again, you can cut the size of the workforce over time using a hiring freeze. But it's really important to kind of set up policies around that and to really outline when you are, what criteria you're going to use to decide when you will make an exception and when you won't. Increasing part-time labor is another possibility, right? This transforms labor into a variable cost. Can reduce your benefit costs. It also could potentially cut your overtime costs if you can add staff at just times of peak demand, and could be a cost-effective way if you just have a lot of temporary demands. Could hire, again, part-time temporary staff. But you want to take caution because sometimes just substituting out part-time folks for full-time employees is not always a one-for-one, right? Those part-time folks might not have the same knowledge, skills, expertise. Can also affect morale, and again, depending on any collective bargaining agreements you're into, that could be your ability to do this could also be limited by those. If pension contributions, increasing your employee pension contributions is one possible option, not for all local governments. But again, if your employees are also receiving other cuts, maybe they're under a wage freeze or hiring freeze, those kinds of things, this is kind of compounding the burden on them and making it sort of less politically feasible. Also, again, difficult to negotiate for governments with organized labor or collective bargaining agreements. So moving into cautionary treatments for capital spending, equipment costs, annual debt costs. A couple things to consider is, again, deferring non-capital projects, using short-term debt to pay for vehicles, right? We really need vehicles today. We don't have the funds to pay for them. We could, could we utilize some short-term debt, deferring or canceling capital projects or maintenance or vehicle replacement, equipment replacement, or restructuring debt. Again, kind of looking into all of these potential options depending on your particular situation. Some organizational strategies. A reorganization, so kind of looking at how you might deliver services differently, deliver program services differently in your organization. Centralizing financial management and human resource activities. I think you all are already pretty centralized, but this is something that a lot of larger organizations often do. And then looking at small or temporary across-the-board budget cuts, right? So we're just going to say, hey, we're going to cut everyone 2% or 3% or, X percent kind of across the board. That can be another sort of organizational-wide strategy. Sourcing strategies. Well, if we've outsourced a service or a program, we could look at bringing it in-house. Will that save us money? Vice versa, if we're today providing it in-house, would it make more sense to outsource it? Kind of exploring both of those. Or then the third option is, should we even do this anymore, right? Should we divest of this? Is this something that we should continue to do going forward? Those are some of the hard conversations we need to have. Sometimes we don't have any other option, and while we may want to, we really want to keep doing something, if we don't have the funds there to pay it and to perform it well, provide the service well, then maybe we are better off kind of divesting of that. Some cautionary strategies for enhancing revenue. A couple things to look at for some local governments might be to obtain better returns on idle cash. Again, that's cautionary because there's risk there, right? You could, sometimes there's risk around getting better returns on idle cash. You definitely don't want to lose, right? Lose any money, so you don't want to get too risky with your investments. And then revisiting any interfund transfer policies. This is most fruitful often with enterprise funds, and if I remember correctly, you just have the internal service fund, no enterprise funds. But sometimes if you have a utility fund, a water fund, something like that, that might not be paying quote unquote its fair share, for general fund services, you can revisit that and kind of see if there's more you can get out of those enterprise funds. Next, we've got some extreme caution treatments. Things that you could look at is for reducing expenditures and then for enhancing revenues. And again, we're saying these are extreme caution. We're not saying they're bad. I always like to make that really clear. Like these can be really good tools. You'll see levying abroad tax increases on there. This is not a bad thing. We're just saying you really need to know all the pros, the cons, the risks that are involved with doing so. Since I was talking about revenues, we'll start there first. Another option would be to look at creating an independent special district with its own taxing authority. We looked at this at one point and when I worked for the city of Chicago. Again, I mentioned the library was a department of the city. We looked at, would it make more sense to sort of spin the library off into its own taxing district? We ended up not doing it, but we looked into it for a brief amount of time. This third one is long-term borrowing without a supporting resource for repayment. I don't know who would even do that, or like who would lend you money if you didn't have a source of repayment, but not a good idea. Tax anticipation notes, again, they can be helpful if you're really just sort of in a cash crunch and you know those tax payments are coming, you just need the cash today. Tax anticipation notes can be very useful in that regard. And then again, if reviewing opportunities to refinance debt at lower interest rates, you're somewhat limited in your ability to do that, but if possible, looking at that. But then on the expenditure side, large or sustained across the board budget cuts. At some point, we just have to figure out, what do we want to keep doing and what we don't. And if we just keep slicing, year after year, 5%, 7%, 10% across the board, at some point, you have departments that are operating at, 20, 70 or 60% of what they were 5 years ago, and they just can't keep doing that, right? They can't sustain it. I remember meeting with, I was working with a small town in Wyoming a few years ago, and I was talking to their department heads, and the parks director was like, I just want them to tell me, and he was saying like, it was his elected body. He was like, I wish the elected body would just tell us like what they want me to close, because every year they just keep telling me to cut another 5% and another 10%. And he's like, I can't keep operating a golf course and 2 swimming pools at like 70% of what I had. Like at some point we just need to stop doing something. But no one wanted to do that. So he was, trying to keep these things running on the, shoestring kind of a budget. It was very, very difficult. Deferring compensation, again, a lot of caution going into that. And then early retirement program also, and the reason that is cautionary is you just don't know what you're going to get, what kind of the take-up's going to be there if you offer that early retirement program. Could be much less than anticipated, it could be much more. You also can have sort of a huge brain drain as well, and a lot of institutional knowledge leaving in a very quick time frame. And then next here we have what we would call the inadvisable treatments. These are, oh, I'm sorry.
Commissioner Monk?
Thank you. Can we go back one slide?
Of course.
I love jumping on the extreme policy ideas. This is the fun
Yeah.
part. So in terms of long-term borrowing without a supporting resource, I would call those pension obligation bonds, and you talk about them on the next page.
Yeah.
And
Don't do them.
well, agreed. Most of the counties and states that issue them don't have the capacity to manage the risk, but actually, if you have a very low borrowing rate and
Sure.
you expect your return is high, you can
Yeah.
do it prudently. It's the case studies of the past.
Yeah, yeah,
aren't
yeah. Fair.
Second thing to say is I would put your last bullet under enhancing revenues. I'd encourage you to move it over to expenditures since you're reducing the cost of borrowing rather than boosting revenues.
Oh, sure. Yep. That's a good point.
And then I might sneak into that last slot that I just opened up for you, a discussion about our $50 million investment pool. And literally almost the same topic, just instead of renegotiating our debt costs, actually thinking about how we invest our $51 million. We have all these different reserve funds, excess, catastrophic, stabilization. And so part of me wants to hear from you, do you have any examples of any governments across the country that have thought about how they invest creatively, innovatively, efficiently to increase the interest that we can expect off of that 50 million or how big it gets over time?
Oh, wow. I'd have to go back and I'd have to get back to you on that one.
Please do.
Yeah. I don't want to just talk off the top of my head there. Yeah, but yeah, we can definitely get
for
you
us,
on
it's
that.
about $3 million a year, $4 million a year, so
Yeah.
it's material.
Yeah.
Councilmember Rennie?
I would add to that, thinking about the problem with the 51 million bucks is we're limited in very conservative investments in those areas. But if we move it into a pension trust that we keep ourselves, you now have options to use that pension trust if you need to pay down pension obligations in a particular year, which opens up money for other things. So effectively, it's kind of a reserve, but you can now invest at higher levels. That you haven't really mentioned those kinds of things in here, and it's a little more risky. You need to think about, well, how much are you willing to have in a pension trust? And the way I think about it, since it really is a reserve that can be used to pay other obligations in that year, freeing up money, it's not really that restricted in that sense. It's fungible.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I realize this has been, largely a lot of information coming at the Council and Finance Commission. We are planning on doing a separate study session on unfunded pension liability and investments and AML and things like that in the fourth quarter. Okay, thank you. Yes, Commissioner Keown.
A lot of what you've gone through is around on the expense side, examples where people are actually cutting. They were at $100 and they cut 7%,
Sure.
10%. That's not our situation. Our problem is not that we've ever cut. Every year our expenses increase, and they've increased going back as far as I can tell. Our problem is the rate of our expenditure growth far exceeds the ability of our tax revenues growing. And if we take the example of the employees and benefits, just the salaries, that growth rate is 2x the taxable rate growth. So what strategies have other municipalities addressed in deflecting the growth rate? Not talking about year-over-year costs. I mean, just saying, we're just going to grow at a slower rate so that we will allow the tax base to finally catch up to the base that we've incurred. I'd love to hear, how people address
I
that.
think a lot of local governments across the country over the past 5 to 7 years are in that same spot, in that, salaries, wages, benefit costs are all increasing rapidly. And if you want to keep your people, right? Like, there was also a time when the job market was very, very competitive. That might be changing today, right? Might be softening up a little bit. But if you didn't keep pace, right, you were going to lose people. And so I think I think the way a lot of local governments are, they're not necessarily slowing the growth. They're figuring out how to keep up with it by finding new sources of revenue or by cutting things, right? Like, they are saying, we're simply, if this gets to a certain point, we can't do the same amount that we used to do, right? If we're not going to increase revenues in some way, right? If we're not going to find new fees, or we're not going to increase taxes, those kinds of things, then we are going to get to a point where we can't necessarily slow that growth. There, that it's growing at the rate it's growing, right? Because of the labor market, then we can't afford to do this same amount, and we will do things differently going forward. So, not saying you're here today, but if things don't continue, right? Like, you've got two sides of the balance, right? You can increase revenues, or you can decrease costs. Those are your two levers.
Can I double click on it? Because to me, that's the essence of the problem we're facing, is that if you just say, well, it's just the way the world works, and my revenues are only going to grow at 4%, and I'm going to allow my rest of my expenditures, at least 70% of them, growing at 8 to 9%. We're looking at a 5-year projection. If it's right, if you believe just mathematically, it says that we won't have any reserves in 5 years. So, combining some of the messages around long-term forecasting, taking a look, we're sitting at that precipice, looking downhill. Sure. How should our elected officials be thinking about? Because I don't think it's all or nothing. I think it's a balance. So that's what I'm really trying to probe, is what creative things have people done around finding, deflecting the growth rate in expenditures, and obviously if there's opportunities for additional revenue.
I think a big part of it too is getting into understanding what you do today. So a lot of, more and more local governments are really getting into and committing to, whether you call it outcome-based budgeting or priority-based budgeting or program-based budgeting or service-based budgeting, but it's not just line items, right? Like, it's, line items like salaries and wages and supplies and things like that. It's really understanding what are the programs and services you provide, what are the service levels you're providing for that, and then what's the cost of that, right? So it's kind of getting a deeper understanding of how you're investing those dollars and what you're getting for it. And I think starting to have conversations about, what are we doing? What are we providing? What service level do we want to provide? And do we want to enhance that service level? Do we want to, decrease that service level? Do we want to keep doing this? Do we not want to keep doing this? But having changing the conversation, basically, right? So we're not just talking about line items. We're talking about what we're investing in, why we're doing it. And again, are there different ways of doing that? I think a lot of local governments are looking at, okay, we like this, we want to keep doing this, but we realize we can't, right? Is that whole idea of like focusing on results? Like, what do we want? And how is it, what are different ways of getting there?
Go ahead, Commissioner. It sounds like you had one more question.
One more follow-up.
Sure.
I agree with you. I think the problem historically, a lot of municipalities have been hamstrung by very traditional budgeting techniques.
Yep.
And if you flip the script and say what we want to think about is budgeting for outcomes, and how much do we really want to invest in a particular outcome along that line? I don't know what you call that, but
Yeah.
who would you point to as a 2 or 3 towns that you think have really done an outstanding job around looking at budgeting from an outcome-based and really then trying to understand the inputs to that, so that we just don't, I mean, I think, it's just my opinion, but it seems foolish to me to just continue to allow this thing growing at this rate, because we know what that outcome will be. No one will be happy.
Sure. Off the top of my head, where's Microsoft headquartered in Washington? No. Redmond. I was going to say Renton, and it's not Renton, it's Redmond. Redmond, Washington. And I can send y'all links. I actually wrote about them a couple years ago for our magazine and interviewed them. And they've been doing what they call it budgeting for outcomes. Or no, they call it budgeting by priority, BPP, I think. But they started this, gosh, I want to say 20 years ago. And the mayoral administration has changed. The new mayor kept it going. Like, it really has. Sometimes these things, it's like a flavor of the month and, it's a fad or whatever. But they've really been been committed and have, doesn't look the same as it did 20 years ago, right? It's evolved, but they, I would say they do a really good job. So I can send y'all information, and obviously
Great.
they're...
That sounds like a great follow-up.
Yeah.
I would like to try to keep us
Oh,
on
sure.
pace to finish
Sorry.
by 8. Commissioner Rogers, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. The one thing I wanted to follow up on was a question about the difference in accounting between GAAP accounting and government accounting. And could you, for the benefit of the listeners and for the people on the commission and they're here, could you give us a good layman's description of the difference between government accounting and GAAP accounting?
Sure. I guess I would, so generally accounting, GAAP, right? Generally accepted accounting principles for governments are outlined by GASB, right? The Governmental Accounting Standards Board. So I guess I would say government accounting is a subset of GAAP. And GAAP for governments does look different, obviously, than it does for private entities. And a big difference comes down to we use these things called funds, right? In the private sector, we don't see those as much. Fund accounting is, the way we do things in the public sector. And then also for the most part, in local government, at least for now you're testing me for our governmental funds. This is where I go in normal, because I am not an accountant by training. These are the types of questions that normally I say, and I will let my accounting colleague answer. So she will be very impressed that I'm remembering all these things. But in the governmental funds, we're primarily using modified accrual accounting, as opposed to in the most part in the private sector, we're using full accruals. So just a difference between when we're recognizing revenue and expenses.
Follow on to my question. Could you give us maybe 3 examples of where government accounting and GAAP accounting are different, and so that I'm trying to find a point at which people that don't have an accounting background have an understanding of the difference between government accounting and generally accepted accounting principles.
That might be one I'm also going to get back to you on. I don't want to give you the wrong examples, but I know we have lots of good ones that we use in our accounting training. I just don't want to mislead anyone right now.
Chris, you're smiling. Are you ready to
Chris
help her
knows this
out
better
here?
than I do.
We can get really into the technical weeds, but it's just a question for the mayor. If you want me to answer, it's just the timing
Of course,
issue.
go ahead. And then we just have a few more slides.
So primary difference is in governmental accounting, we're looking at current financial resources as opposed to economic resources, which is in the private sector. So in the private sector, you're accounting for all assets and liabilities irrespective of the timing. In governmental accounting, especially in the governmental funds like the general fund, which is our primary operating budget, we're not accounting for all those assets and liabilities. Those end up showing up in our government-wide financial statements. So when we typically budget, you're not going to see depreciation and all those type of expenses show up, because what we care about is what's happening now. Secondly, in the private sector accounting, revenues and expenses are all accounted for, where in modified accrual in governmental accounting, we only care about the revenues where we're due to derive over the course of 60 days past the fiscal year. So whether I earned it in the current year and I get it a little bit later, if it's not within those 60 days, I'm not accounting for that revenue in terms of my general fund. And the last difference is there are distinct funds in governmental accounting, and there's no discrete fund structure in private sector accounting. And so private sector accounting boils things down to holistic financial statements, but because accountability in government is so important, there's a structure that there are multiple funds that you create, general fund being a singular fund for operations, but when you have restrictions on the use of certain activity and money, you have to put it in a distinct fund to be able to demonstrate to the public what money came in, what money went out for accountability purposes. There's more differences, but those are just three to highlight.
Hopefully that helped everybody.
Yeah.
To some
It
degree.
helped me. So that's for sure. Okay, so let's continue on, and then if there are questions along the way.
Great. So these are our inadvisable treatments, things that we would not recommend that local governments employ. So underfunding accrued liabilities, pension obligation bonds, defaulting on debt, not ever a good idea. Shifting operational costs into capital budgets, also not a great idea. Having an asset fire sale, and what we mean that, right, we're not saying selling assets. I mean, it's a typical, a fire sale would be like literally I'm selling whatever I have to anyone who will take it at whatever price I can get for it, right? Different from being really measured and thoughtful about how I might monetize assets. Using accounting manipulations goes without saying, I hope, but don't lie to get out of your financial distress. And then also don't dilute or dismantle any internal controls. We wouldn't recommend that. Again, we always would, just reminder that in extreme cases, sometimes you might have to use some combination of all of these, right? The cautionary, the extreme caution, even the inadvisable treatments. And the key really is just understanding the risks associated with each of those and going into them, eyes wide open and mitigating those risks. Step 6, again, we spent all that time just on step 5. Step 6 is getting into a more detailed diagnosis. We really think it's important to understand what's driving and causing your financial distress. We kind of have created these 2 dimensions that you can use to help you with this diagnosis, and those would be an internal versus external causes, and then economic technical causes versus political causes. And so we've got this kind of 2 axes here to kind of demonstrate kind of what we're talking about here in terms of, you could think about the different causes and sort of plot them on something like this as sort of what's more internal and technical versus what's internal and political, what's political and external, and then what's sort of more economic, technical, and external, and kind of thinking about your, again, what might be causing your distress, helpful to plot on this way, so then you can help also think through how are we going to address it going forward. And then just a reminder, again, moving to step 8 in the longer term treatments, just keeping in mind these pillars, because a lot of, again, once you've diagnosed right here, a lot of if you have a lot of sort of internal political, or even some of the internal economic or technical kind of things driving those factors that are driving your distress, can be really helpful, again, to think back about these pillars and to figure out, what do I need to change within the organization in terms of governance, in terms of collaboration, policies that we need to change to make sure that we don't find ourselves in this place again, right? So we don't want to just have this emerging from financial distress isn't just about this one instance of financial distress. We really want to make it so that we are much more adaptable going forward as well. And then some of the longer term technical treatments, a lot of these we've talked about, but controlling employee benefit and healthcare costs to the extent that you can. One thing we talked earlier about sort of healthcare, what you might do about healthcare costs and not cut benefits. But I know some places have moved toward, and when I first heard about this, I was sort of, what? But some local governments that they provide coverage for the employee and any dependents, but the spouse or partner coverage, they will only provide coverage to the spouse or partner if that person doesn't also have coverage elsewhere. And when I first, I was talking with my client and they were just telling me this, and I was like, that's just weird. Like, why do you do that? And I manage all that side of the, in my household, I manage the insurance and all that. And I was like, that would be a nightmare if I have to manage like 2 insurance providers. Like, what are you talking about? And they were very matter of fact about it. They're like, that's how we keep our costs lower. Like, we've limited that, and it really does help. Also, some folks who've moved toward, offering kind of incentive payments. So if you don't take the insurance that is offered and you're on your spouse's or partner's insurance, then you get some sort of cash payment. That can be a way to, help control costs a little bit. Again, reforming pensions, sometimes very limited in your ability to do that, but something to, how you might be able to. Again, budget better. We started talking about that a little bit, right? We're moving away from incremental budgeting, again, starting to think about whether we call it program budgeting or outcome budgeting. But GFOA has a ton of resources on this, because we've just spent the last 3 years embarking on an initiative we call Rethinking Budgeting, and we've really trying to get local governments away from just that sort of traditional line item incremental budgeting. Again, stopping or reducing lower priority services, right? Once you started thinking about what's really important to us, what do we need to do differently going forward? For some services, thinking about how you can shift from just remediating to working more on prevention. This can be helpful for a lot of, a variety of services, particularly when we think about health services, mental health services, homeless services, those kinds of things. Investing in prevention is, research shows is just far more economical. Improving or simplifying work processes, right? How can this goes back to that focus on results. How can we do what we're doing, but do it in a different way going forward? This next point is, overcoming the limits of local government fragmentation. What we're really talking about is how can you partner with other local governments to get things done differently? Is there an opportunity for that? More financially savvy community and economic development kind of goes with the next one too, about taming the use of economic development incentives. Again, might not make sense for you, but some local governments are finding that they haven't always made the best sort of land use decisions, or they're giving out way too generous with economic development incentives, things like that. So looking at those, and then again, more financially sustainable land use patterns, right? Building denser, those kinds of things. Again, not all of these will work everywhere. We're just sort of, always saying, hey, worth looking into seeing what might work for your community. And then,
Maybe,
oh, yep.
maybe we'll just take a pause here. I see the material coming on ACFR and financial statements, but it doesn't look like there's much time for depth or exploring that area. And
Yep.
so I'm wondering if we could better use our time with any questions about practices or ideas, particularly since we're going to go into a budget discussion tomorrow. And the Finance Commission has been in one for several weeks now. Maybe I could see if we could maybe use that time for some questions about that. And I'm willing to start off with one, and that is that, most of our costs are people related, either in salaries or largely in pensions. One of the things that I'm familiar with from the private sector is knowing how many FTEs you have, not how many employees are on the payroll at a point in time, or how many slots you've predicted for the future, but what is your actual workforce? Meaning, standard definition of FTE, meaning the total hours worked divided by the standard hours available to work.
Sure.
And you come up with a number and you look at where you are. Do municipalities and government agencies look at things the same way in terms of looking at the FTEs of their workforce?
Yeah, I would say most of them, when they're calculating their FTEs, they will calculate things off of a 40-hour work week, so they'll use the 2080 hours. But they might adjust for that if their standard work week is less than 40 hours. So some local governments you might have a 35-hour work week. Some, I think, have like a 37.5-hour work week. But sometimes they'll adjust that and use something less than 2080 to figure out their FTEs if, in fact, they haven't, it is less.
And just a comment on that is, it seems to me that choosing the precise way, whether you're using 35 hours or 35 hours with vacation or not, isn't as important as using the same way every period, so that you know whether your workforce is
right.
growing or not.
Yeah.
And choosing one way to do it and to do it consistently. But it is fairly common practice to be able to report your FTEs. Yeah.
Yes, I would say agreed, yes.
Okay. Other questions or ideas? Yes, Commissioner Rogers.
Thank you. Another along the lines of what you're discussing is taking a look at what we spend as a town on consultants. Seems to me that whenever there is an issue, we say, well, we will get a consultant to come in and it's going to cost $50,000. I'm not certain what scrutiny is placed on determining that that's always the right number, but it looks to me like we use consultants rather frequently. I see a nodding yes.
Any comment about whether that's something that appears in the budgets and is something that you can benchmark against other municipalities?
The use of consultants in particular?
Yes.
Ooh. I think that would be really difficult to benchmark, just because the line items across local governments are so different, and you can, like, where you would budget for consulting contracts across, I think it would just be very difficult just by looking at their budget to know what's consulting contracts and what's other kinds of things. But I would say, I mean, there's, one of the things I had on there was sort of like digging into, like, understanding your, auditing routine expenditures. So looking at and understanding, the last 5 years worth of consulting contracts, what did we spend them on? What did we get them for, right? Nothing wrong with like diving into that a little bit more and trying to understand that better. I don't know, I'm assuming Chris has done that sort of analysis, but, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Commissioner Reiners?
I'm not sure how to phrase this exactly, but I wanted to go back to some of the conversation we had around risk and budgeting and reserves. In this case, I'm talking about budget reserves, not financial reserves. In my past life, I would have thought about, I want to budget my departments at about what I would call a 50-50 confidence, which means, they're roughly equal, that they may or may not make it, but at large, all departments, probably some put and some take, and you kind of get there. And I would have used budget reserves as a mechanism to increase my overall confidence of achieving my budget to something like an 80-20 confidence by having an unassigned balance of some kind somewhere that I could use to deal with unexpected risk. Is that something that's talked about in this kind of a field, and how do you see it working typically?
Yes, we have a paper on this, and I can't remember the exact name of it. But my colleague Shane Kavanaugh wrote a paper on this, and it was basically about, so this, we try to get away, departments sometimes pad their budgets, right, to account for risk. I know I did this when I was managing department budgets, I will admit it. That, I'm going to ask for a little bit more than I need because, I don't know, there might be stuff that comes up in the middle of the year and I need, the mayor might ask me to do something and I need money to be able to do that thing. And everybody does that, right? If every department does that, and let's say it's, 10 to 20% more than they need, right? You multiply that times every department, now all of a sudden you've budgeted way more than you need. So how could you, it depends on having trust, right, between the departments, but if you could get them to commit to like, hey, don't over budget. If something comes up, I got your back, I will fund that for you, right? If something unknown comes up, I've got it. But then essentially you create a central risk pool, right? This is a new risk, right? To your point, and you've budget, right? This is a budgeted reserve for, let's just call it like mid-year surprise reserve or something, right? Like we call it whatever. But now you're budgeting something, but you're not budgeting all those departments times 20%. You're budgeting something smaller than that because there's no chance in heck that all 20 departments are gonna, need 20%. So you figure out what that right amount is, budget that amount, and you still, even though you've now created this additional reserve, you're still saving money in the long run. So it's a different paper than that, I think. No, I can't remember. I'll find it in a second. But we've had some departments experiment with this and try it. In fact, I want to say the Denver Public Library tried it, and again she got all the different departments in the library to agree not to pad their budget, and then created this pot that people could basically apply to, right? If you had unanticipated expenses during the year, you could come and submit a request to that reserve pot to fund it. So yes, absolutely. When you started talking, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what we've been talking about. So.
Other questions? I had one more. I've been going back to our discussion about fund balances and about reserves. And Commissioner Monk's point about 51 million in investments and against revenue of approximately what? Chris, what are our revenues? About 60 million. So we're talking about 51 million against 60 million. How should we go about benchmarking or evaluating whether these reserves are correct? So we have several, like budget stabilization for 8 million and catastrophic for 8 million that are written by ordinance and have certain the word committed with them. But in total, in our general fund, it's about 29 million. How should we go about figuring out whether that's the right amount? And, not only in looking in detail at the activities that they're meant to reserve for and the risks, but also with regard to other communities. What's the best way for us to find that information?
So yeah, there's two questions there. So A, would always recommend, undertaking some sort of risk analysis. In terms of knowing, like looking at other organizations and benchmarking, yeah, you can dig into, like, a lot of this information probably is public. They'll have it in their ACFRs or in their budgets. So you could dig into and see what your, figure out what your, what are the best, again, cities you want to benchmark to, cities and towns you want to benchmark to, and kind of look that information up. And you could, you could find that. We always say a little bit of caution there, just because they're not like you, right? They're like you in some ways, but unlike you in other ways. So just always take caution there.
So does GFOA have resources for looking at appropriate reserve levels?
Yes, we absolutely do. So we've got plenty of sort of do-it-yourself like resources on our website, and then we also have an entire consulting practice around that as well. Okay,
thank you. It strikes me that that's something that we're going to want to look at because we have some structural deficits going forward, but they're overwhelmed by the amount of reserves that we have. So we probably need to look. So, Vice Mayor.
Thank you. Yeah, sort of along the same lines as the last two questions, are there particular best practices? We're looking at, sort of balancing budget cutting with going into our reserves, right? And under the guidance of our new town manager, we now have the unassigned fund balance that is recommended. We didn't used to have that. And so is there a best practice for how much to go each way? Because I think that's sort of what we're weighing in terms of cost cutting and taking from reserves, and I think within that is there part of what you talked about that I think is sometimes a little bit hard to talk about is the political feasibility, right? And the need to, if the town of Los Gatos has a structural deficit, like, perhaps we do, but every year for the last 10 years, we haven't, it hasn't really manifested. We haven't had to feel the effects of that. How do we demonstrate adequately our financial situation to our community in a way that might make for the political feasibility of future actions that we might need to take?
Sure. There's a lot there. I think, to me, it all does start with, right? It's hard to go out to the voters and say we need more money for whatever it is, right? Any kind of new, whether it's new fees or new tax, anything like that, right? You're going out and asking for that. If you can't show them, right, and tell them the story that you are using the resources you have today in the best possible way, in the most prudent way. And so I do think a big part of that is starting with telling that story of today, right? Here's why we have X amount in this type of reserve. Here's why we have this amount in this type of reserve. Here's why we have X amount in unassigned, right? Like explaining all of that, making sure you all are on the same page with that, making sure you're confident in that, and those are the right amounts. You feel good about all of those things, and right. But I think it is going to be really difficult to go out to the community and ask for anything different, more, right, in any way, shape, or form, without being able to tell that story first. Because again, they need to feel comfortable, right, and trust that you are using those resources in the best way possible today, and in a way that has the community's best interest. Yeah.
And then to the first, I asked a long question. So the first part of the question being sort of cost cutting versus taking out of reserves, best practices.
I guess, I would also always go back to that recurring revenues, recurring expenditures, right? And so if you're dipping into reserves to fund recurring to avoid having to cut recurring expenditures, I would say it can get you, to me, it all depends on how long are you going to have to do that, right? Like if you think, ooh, this is just a bad year, I'm going to do that this year, but we're going to bounce back next year or the following year, like, okay. But if that goes on, right, and you've done that now 3 years in a row, like maybe that is sort of like, oh, we can't keep doing that, right? Because we're using non-recurring sources. And even if it takes me 20 years, like I'm on this path though to where I might not be in good shape down the road.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Chair Reiners?
Just can't help but foot stomp. We frequently are talking about expenditure cuts, which I think is appropriate, and the frugal culture I thought was appropriate for us to start thinking about. But I really wish we would focus more discussion on raising revenues other than just tax base. And in some cases, I think there's opportunities for us to do both. And please don't tell the parking guy I said this, because I'm not saying do the parking thing that's in the tiers. But it's a great example in my mind where you potentially are charging for services that you're currently not charging or taking advantage of. You potentially are cutting expenses for things that you're providing that you no longer would need. It's kind of a win-win. So I think finding things that, all those things that are hidden in our infrastructure that we can go after that do both, but don't forget about revenue opportunities that we have not tapped yet. And please don't tell the parking guy I said that.
Councilmember Rennie?
I want to go back to Councilmember Moore's last question about cutting versus dipping into reserves. Now, there's a difference between budgeting and reality. And our budgeting is usually conservative. So the point in this year's budget that we'll talk about tomorrow is we've narrowed it down to a more precise, hopefully, deficit. But the question is, it's still somewhat conservative in that we probably won't have that bad a deficit. So if you go make cuts that you didn't really need, so again, I'm getting to the point there's a difference between budgeting and then actually using reserves. If we're budgeting to use reserves that are never used, then we aren't making cuts that don't need to be made. So I just wanted to.
No, I think that's
I didn't want to leave it the way it was said, because there's a little more to the whole picture.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, in that if you are budgeting your revenues conservatively and they actually come in higher than you think they are, and then, right, you've budgeted to use some of your reserves, but you never actually had to. Yeah, and I think having that conversation and being really explicit about that, like, hey, we are doing this, but if X, Y, and Z happen, this actually is not, bad, right? We're all on the same point about that. We aren't going to be out of structural balance if X, Y, and Z happen. Then I think that's like, again, it's you sort of have it. You're hedging risk there a little bit, right? Like you're covering it. So yeah, I think that is a good conversation to be having, and everyone's on the same page about that. Yeah.
Councilmember Risto?
Thank you. Yeah, to follow up with that, I think for some of us psychologically, it's an incremental approach to looking at what does it look like in 5 years. If we really do have a looming deficit, what are a not painful number of potential cuts? What are some revenue that we haven't been recovering that we can look at?
Yeah.
And it's more of a political decision, but is it okay to plan that if everything goes exactly forecast, we may have to dip into reserves this year, but that's not a strategy. And if we have to do that, then the following year, there may have to be further cuts, et cetera. But approximating it without just saying, okay, we're just going to whack to Payne to start with, and then giving time for enhanced revenue to come forward, not necessarily a tax measure, but there's other options. And so just trying to meet there.
Yeah. Again, I think having these conversations is really important, right? And that everyone has the shared understanding, I think there's a lot of value in that. So yeah, I think that makes, having everyone on the same page about that is really important, I think, yeah.
Thank you.
Commissioner Keown?
I have to follow up with this because I want to make sure that we're using the right language. In the budget that's being put forth, there is no cutting of expense. We are not going to spend less in the budget than we actually spent last year. What we're talking about is, can we live with a growth rate that is more within the means of what our revenue base can do? And I think it's important to be clear about the challenge in front of us. And historically, we've just had our expense base run away from us. I'm sure for a lot of good reasons, and we all understand that. But I think we need to flip the script. I think you talked about it. I think we need to look at how other towns like Redmond flip the script away from an incremental approach where we just sort of add each year to really understanding from a priority standpoint or from an output standpoint, what does it really cost us to deliver the output that we want? And I don't believe that we'll really see the kind of changes that we want until we adopt a different planning strategy. I don't see it. I mean, we can sit around and try to look for incremental revenue sources, but remember, most of the big ones are going to be required a vote of the citizens. I'm not certain that there's the political will for that to happen. And I think the reality is that we got to earn the right to be able to ask for a tax increase, and I'm not quite certain we've done everything we need to do to be able to earn the right for that. That's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, thanks. As usual, we've blown past my time estimations by a large amount. So if there's not a burning question, I will close the session with a very big thank you for the information you've provided. And the information in some cases was maybe we assumed we knew it, but I also think it triggered a lot of thinking for something very relevant, which is our budget session tomorrow. And so thank you to the town manager, and thank you for your information and for taking all these questions.
Oh, by all means, thank you for having me. This was great. I really enjoyed being here and prepping for it and talking with you. And really, don't let this be the end. Like, if you all have questions, you're falling asleep tonight and you're like, oh, I really wish I would have asked X or Y or Z, please pass it on to Chris. And we can follow up. We could, it's a long flight for me, so I don't know if I want to fly out back, but we could do a Zoom, or I can get you, answers. Really, we are here to be a resource to you. So we're happy to help in any way.
Great. We really appreciate it. And with that, this session's adjourned.